Jews established settlements throughout the late 19th century. The whole Jewish community by 1914 constituted barely 8% of the population. The Zionist leader in Britain, Chaim Weizmann, had been lobbying the government for a guarantee that in the event of an Ottoman defeat, it would support Jewish emigration to Palestine.
Greater Syria was a major region of the Middle East at the turn of the 20th century. It became part of the Ottoman Empire in 1516 and remained Ottoman until the end of the First World War in 1918. Greater Syria's southern province, Palestine, was an active part of the Ottoman world. Trade boomed in its commercial centers, which included Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Haifa.
فلسطين كان فيها شعب نشيط فعال منتج مفكر مبدع.
The bitter struggle between Arab and Jew for control of the Holy Land has caused untold suffering in the Middle East for generations. This letter of October the 26th, 1915, outlined the main points of the arrangement.
The actual document itself is absolutely riven with ambiguity. There's no doubt about that. The question is whether Hussein recognizes that. My sense of Hussein is that he does recognize it. In other words, there is no wool being pulled over his eyes, because he's perfectly aware that if he's going to create a modern Arab empire, he's going to need some logistical, economic development, and that can only come from the outside world.
Taking Britain's assurances of support at face value, Hussein, together with his sons Faisal and Abdullah, amassed a sizable force. The new army was commanded by the young and charismatic Faisal, who had captured the imagination of the Arab masses in the quest for Arab independence.
A major enemy of the United States, and supporting radical Islam, which the U.S. supported. And it continues right until the present. Right now, we saw an example of that just during the latest Gaza attack. You recall that at one point, Israel began to run out of munitions during the assault, despite the fact that it's armed to the teeth. That the United States provided Israel with additional munitions through the Pentagon.
Yet even as Hussein and Faisal mobilized their troops, the British were preparing to sell them short. Back in London, in the spring of 1916, Britain was negotiating with France about the future shape of the Middle East. Behind closed doors, Sir Mark Sykes of the British Foreign Office had been meeting his French opposite number, François-Georges Picot. Britain knew it was vital to offer the French a stake in the spoils of the Ottoman Empire, should they win the war.
There was an awareness on the British side that they had made such huge sacrifices that one couldn't just ignore French ambitions, and that the French were determined to have their historical piece of the Levant.
Poring over a map of the Levant, Sykes and Picot personally drew in the areas they wished to see under their control. Their secret deal amounted to the virtual carve-up of the Middle East. In Area A for the French and Area B for the British, the imperialists intended to exercise power indirectly. They would appoint advisors and take charge of the finances in their respective spheres of influence. Then there was the area colored blue, which was to be directly controlled by France. This included what was then known as Greater Syria, where the French traditionally had commercial and religious interests. As for the area coloured pink, known as Iraq, with its strategic ports, railways and oil, this was to be under British rule. The area coloured yellow represented Palestine and was envisaged as an international zone, except for Haifa.
What the British wanted was the oil of Iraq, and they concentrated on getting Iraq and getting away from Iraq to the Mediterranean in order to transport this oil. So they got Haifa on the Palestinian coast, and they got most of Iraq.
And notice where they were taken from. These were U.S. munitions pre-positioned in Israel for eventual use by U.S. forces. One of many signs of how Israel is regarded as essentially a military offshoot of the United States. Very close intelligence relations that go way back, many other connections. And the media tend to take up, to support the policy of the government with very few, kind of little questioning around the edges, but basically accept the policy. So, for example, take another issue. Take the U.S. invasion of Iraq. You cannot find the phrase U.S. invasion of Iraq in the U.S. media. There was obviously an invasion, a blatant act of aggression, a textbook case of that's Nuremberg trials called the supreme international crime.
The Sykes-Picot Agreement was a pretty shameful document, and I wouldn't attempt to defend it. But it was drawn up by people who were sort of operating under the old kind of balance of power considerations in an imperial frame of mind.
Unaware of these secret dealings behind their backs, Hussein and Faisal proclaimed independence and in June 1916 attacked the Turkish troops. The Arab revolt against the Ottomans had begun. The Turkish garrison at Mecca was soon overrun, and the seaport at Jeddah seized. By 1917, Hussein and Faisal's forces had pushed north and engaged the Ottoman Turks along the Hejaz Railway. The British saw the Arab revolt as part of its strategy for creating a military diversion against the Central Powers. In a pincer movement, Britain had launched a campaign from the southwest to ensure control of the Suez Canal and the Levant. And from the southeast, it was fighting to secure the oil wells of Iraq. All this to attack the Central Powers at their weakest point, the Ottoman Empire.
هنا القدس صوت فلسطين من القدس.
مستمعينا الأعزاء أهلا ومرحبا بكم مع حلقة جديدة من برنامجنا.
Palestinian society in 1920 was a society in transition.
By early 1917, Lloyd George's view of Jews as globally influential convinced him that Zionism was another nationalist movement which should be co-opted to the Allied cause. In March, Mark Sykes began negotiations with Weizmann.
There is a bee in the bonnet of people like Mark Sykes that actually the Jews do ultimately look to each other and look to their own interest. And if that interest, as they are being told by Weizmann, is what we really want is Palestine, they're prepared to believe it. They're prepared to go along with it.
As negotiations with Weizmann continued over the following months, The war deteriorated rapidly for the Allies. The German submarine campaign was seriously weakening Britain's merchant fleet. And although America had entered the war on the Allied side, President Woodrow Wilson was not yet willing to supply a significant number of troops. Britain's latest attempt to keep up the pressure on the Western Front soon became bogged down in the muddy trenches of Passchendaele. As thousands of young men's lives were wasted in another fruitless campaign, morale amongst the soldiers plummeted. But the most serious threat to the Allied war machine came from the east. Russia was on the verge of collapse. After massive defeats at the hands of the Germans, the war-weary country was disintegrating, with food shortages, strikes, and demonstrations. When the Tsar was deposed in a revolution, Britain and France became greatly alarmed.
The point is that once Russia and its war effort begins to collapse, essentially the Germans have won the First World War unless they bring the Americans in. There's no way that the British and the French on their own are ever going to defeat Germany.
In October, the British government received an intelligence report suggesting that Jews were a significant influence in the leadership of the Bolshevik Party, the new revolutionary movement emerging as the dominant force in Russia. Lloyd George feared that these communists would take Russia out of the war. With the Americans still refusing to commit sufficient forces, he knew it was time to act. He instructed his Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to issue a pledge to capture the hearts and minds of the Jewish people.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievements of this object.
The Balfour Declaration was issued on November 2nd, 1917, just as British forces were occupying Palestine.
I would say that the Balfour Declaration has to be understood not as an idealistic gesture, but it has to be understood within the framework of British imperial policy. And Lloyd George was the main instigator of that declaration because he believed that it would serve Britain's interests.
But this was also the first time that any major European power had given official backing for the Zionist goal of making Palestine into a Jewish homeland. Yet Sharif Hussein had understood that Palestine had been promised as part of his deal for Arab independence. Anticipating Arab outrage at the prospect of a Jewish homeland in a largely Arab province, the Balfour Declaration had also stated that
nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
The declaration, nonetheless, appeared to indicate British support for Jewish emigration.
There were only a mere 80,000 out of some like 700,000 people in Palestine who were Jews. The indigenous inhabitants of Palestine were referred to as non-Jewish inhabitants, and that Palestine was being identified even at that stage as a Jewish land, and all the others had no defined identity. They were simply non-Jewish.
The Balfour Declaration was what it says, a declaration. It wasn't a treaty, it wasn't a signed agreement, it was a declaration in support of the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
Cannot be mentioned. President Obama is praised as an opponent of the invasion. And what did he say? He said it's a mistake. It's a strategic blunder. We're not going to get away with it. That's about as That's the kind of opposition that you heard from the German General Staff during Hitler's invasion of Russia. It's a blunder. Shouldn't do it. Should knock off England first. That's regarded as opposition. Same in Vietnam. There's now a commemoration underway, big commemoration of U.S. sacrifices in Vietnam. Try to find the phrase U.S. invasion of South Vietnam there or anywhere in the past year since 1961 when it took place. Non-existent, maybe on Democracy Now, what I write, but way out at the fringe. And this is not unique to the United States. Take, say, Britain. Right now there's interesting debates in the British literary journals, like the Times Literary Supplement, as to whether Britain should finally begin to recognize the genocidal, the word that's used, genocidal character of British colonization hundreds of years ago. Should Britain begin to face it? You can ask that question in many places. The tendency of the intellectual community to go along like a herd in support of state power, private power, is just overwhelming. Intellectuals like to think of themselves as dissident, critical, courageous, standing up against power. Absolutely untrue. You look at the historical record, that's a small fringe, and they're usually punished.